start shortly.
This session of the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee, where we'll be conducting an inquiry into devolution capability in Whitehall. We have 3 witnesses today, and I'd like to ask each of you to identify yourselves in turn. First of all, Jayne Brady. Jayne, could you just introduce yourself, please? Can she not hear us? Don't. Jayne, are you muted? I don't.
Not hearing us?
I don't think she can hear us. All right.
I can hear you, yes.
Oh, you can hear us now. Good.
Yes, I can, Chair.
Could you introduce yourself for the record, please?
My name is Jayne Brady, and I am the head of the Northern Ireland Civil Service.
Thank you. And Dr. Goodall?
Good afternoon. I'm Andrew Goodall. I'm the Permanent Secretary for Welsh Government.
And finally, Mr. Marks.
Afternoon. I'm JP Marks, Permanent Secretary of the Scottish Government. Thank you.
Well, once again, welcome all. And as you know, this inquiry is into devolution capability in Whitehall. And could I ask each of you what you would regard as the characteristics of a Whitehall that is devolution capable, and also how you would assess the current performance of Whitehall against those characteristics. Jayne Brady.
Thank you, Chair. I think the characteristics for engagement with Whitehall from a devolved administration perspective covers a number of key elements. Obviously, there is the constitution element, and Northern Ireland has a special position within that, within its own constitution and the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. But at the core of any engagement with devolved administrations, the principle for respect and understanding of those devolution settlements. Of course, those are the reserved matters, the matters reserved for the UK Government and Whitehall, but those that are accepted and devolved to the institutions. And to give those effect, of course, there's institution structures, the departmental structures, the government structures, and where the possibility lies. Obviously, within a Northern Ireland context, we have a mandatory 4-party coalition, which was established under the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. So the political context is critically important, and indeed, over my tenure in the civil service, I have had 2 years without an executive, in my 2.5 years operation, and the role of the Northern Ireland office has been critical in terms of delivering on that governance gap and making sure that services were continued within a budgetary context. I would say, in terms of the operation of that, much of that is regarding the relationships and personalities which underlie those engagements and that good and ready engagement. And I would say also with my colleagues across the DAs, with JP and with Andrew, who have been a tremendous support for me through this period, but also those common learnings and those support with DAs and also my colleagues, not only in the NIO, but in DLUC as well as indeed in Whitehall. The principles that I would say are underpin that good governance is early engagement, particularly in terms of policies or process discussions to understand the context of the devolved administration for Northern Ireland in our case, but also that openness and transparency and building trust as those processes or programmes are developed. And obviously the good communications that must go with building that openness and trust, and obviously the flexibility in resolving issues, of which there will be in the nature of devolved administrations. There are many structures in place to do that. There are the formal structures, intergovernmental reviews. There is the BIC, the British Irish Council, of which I've attended all across these islands in my tenure. And we have also just been party to the establishment of the East-West Council, so there's formal structures in place. But there are also the informal structures of regular engagement with my colleagues in NIO, with my colleagues in DLUC, and indeed my colleagues in the DAs, where we meet every number of weeks in terms of engagement. My view would be that it was a very positive and collaborative relationship in that regard. It will be of no surprise to anyone that Northern Ireland has gone through quite a bit of transformation in the last couple of years in particular, following the EU exit and the Windsor framework, and that spirit of cooperation and engagement and the role of UKG in supporting the restoration of executive has been really critical and key. Also, I would say at a characteristic level up to indicate that the level of support that we have engaged in, that is our engagement at the Devolution Week and representation. I also have been able to sit on the panel for 2 DG appointments in Scotland and also in Whitehall in DLUC. In addition, my colleagues in the DAs have also sat in department panels for some of my permanent secretary cohort within Northern Ireland. So that gives an anecdotal representation of the strength of those relationships and the impact it has really made both in the operational but also the strategic context.
Thank you. Dr. Goodall.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I call out 4 criteria that I think are really useful to use and understand. First of all, to make sure that there is a strong understanding of the respective devolution settlements. I think that allows us to make sure we're able to embrace positive engagement and ensure that we are focused on getting things to happen together, although to some extent there will be variable experiences on that. I think that has been something that I've experienced in my 10 years sitting in Welsh Government, and have continued to provide sort of personal support on giving that insight alongside colleagues as well. I think secondly, just a regular rhythm of engagement and contact. That's absolutely true on the official side. Whilst we need to rely on structures, I think structures are improved when we're also able to discharge them with confidence and with some of those relationships and networks in place. But certainly that rhythm of engagement is also a key requirement in terms of the ministerial oversight that happens. And that's where some of the intergovernment relations framework is helpful to spell out some of those expectations. Thirdly, just to make sure that when we are working our way through the range of areas that we are talking in dealing with UK government colleagues, and certainly where we're on the boundaries of devolved and reserved responsibilities, just to make sure that we are discharging a commitment. Again, I would say this is for ministers as well as officials to use those mechanisms to best effect. I think that allows us to feel that we are enabled to manage that environment. And the fourth criteria that I would share is really about we don't just turn up for a conversation when devolution is being discussed. I am part of the UK civil service team. I work alongside my other permanent secretary colleagues. I interact with JP and with Jayne on a very regular basis. But the same is true of other departmental permanent secretaries as well. So we're able to, again, discharge those arrangements. In reverse order on those areas, I think we do the latter very well. I absolutely have felt since my arrival into post that I am properly part of those arrangements alongside other colleagues, and really grateful for that support and the way in which we work in the civil service. I think the way in which the mechanisms are discharged can be generally good at times, but can be difficult in some of the dealings with individual departments. We also need to make sure that we are actively working within those mechanisms ourselves. I think the rhythm of engagement and the contact can be difficult. We've seen that working really well at times, and then we have seen it slip off. But there are some really good examples of interministerial committees that do work with a regular beat, like the meeting between finance ministers, which has, I think, been probably the most successful of those areas. And on the understanding of devolution, I think despite the fact we are 25 years into our devolved arrangements in Wales, I think we just need to continue to work to support colleagues in their understanding, and when we spot any areas, to offer our support for understanding and vice versa. And there are various mechanisms in place I'm sure we can explore that help us to achieve that.
You mentioned difficulties in dealing with individual departments. What sort of difficulties do you have in mind?
I think sometimes there are departments who have been maybe much more embedded alongside devolved responsibilities. So whilst you may expect this to be at times a more difficult relationship on the one hand, I do think that the way in which Welsh Government has worked alongside DEFRA colleagues over the years has actually been a pretty effective network. We're able to, share information, learn from others, and bring together those reflections. There are professional networks in the middle of those, the way in which the Chief Veterinary Officer works. My own background, as you may be aware, is in the health context as a NHS Welsh Chief Executive and Director General, and really good and effective relationships in place there. There are, however, some areas where perhaps the contact points have been, more limited, or can be good in some areas, but have been trickier on others. So I've picked these types of issues up with Permanent Secretary colleagues and talking about it. But some of the way in which asylum accommodation is worked through from a Home Office perspective can be difficult in the sense that when areas are being looked at in England, there will tend to be a sort of background departmental review of the expectations, the way in people are going to work together, put packages of support in place. Sometimes that works in a more difficult way when it's coming into a devolved government environment, because Welsh Government will have many of the responsibilities providing those aspects of support. So just ensuring that there is earlier engagement, I think, is probably more my request, and what we're trying to focus on to make sure we're able to discharge those well, because we are able to provide the appropriate support when we have that very early and effective engagement.
Mr. Marks.
Thanks. So maybe just build a bit on Jayne and Andrew's contributions, which I agree with. One place to start for the committee on what does a sort of devolution confident approach look like is to start with the principles from the IGR review, because we recognise those as well defined. So Andrew and Jayne have already summarised what good looks like, good constructive relations, mutual respect, a shared role in the governance of 4 nations, building and maintaining trust, effective comms, sharing information, confidentiality, promoting an understanding and accountability of intergovernmental activity and resolving disputes when they emerge. So we think those principles of what good looks like are well defined through the IGR review, and builds on a lot of the findings from the Dunlop review as well. And as Jayne and Andrew say, we have a lot of good experiences where that does work very well. I would agree with Andrew's point with regards the FISC, the Finance Interministerial Standing Committee. That's met 8 times so far under the IGR arrangements. And for us in Scotland, for example, that bilateral relationship between our Deputy First Minister and Chief Secretary led to a revised fiscal framework for Scotland last year. And that was very much underpinned by exceptional work between Treasury colleagues in Whitehall and my Exchequer team in Scotland. Maybe just a couple of additional points. I think interchange is an opportunity that we can continue to develop going forwards. For us in Scotland, we've got, at the minute around 24 fast streamers, 45 of my team on UK civil service talent programmes, and around 240 colleagues a year will move in between UK government departments and the Scottish government and vice versa. So that's the level of churn. So when I look across my senior team, a number of my senior civil servants have been senior civil servants in UK government departments. So there's an established understanding of how the DWP, the FCDO, HMRC or whatever work, because colleagues have developed their careers there before moving to us and vice versa as well. Perhaps just the final thing is, and Andrew alludes to this, the point around 25 years into devolution to date and what the future holds, is how we make sure we are mainstreaming devolution capability in the way we do good government. And what I mean by that, for example, if I look at something like green free ports or social security, my team's integrated with UK government teams through shared governance with joint programmes to deliver optimal outcomes from my perspective in Scotland, recognising the mutual dependency we have on systems, on data, and on services in communities. And that works really well, for example, with HMRC, with DWP, with DEFRA, as Andrew alluded to, and others as well. So that integration, so colleagues are used to working together day in, day out to effect and deliver for their respective ministers. I think is the sort of confident way of working that I'm continuing to try and encourage here in Scotland. Thanks.
Thank you. You mentioned, Mr. Marks, briefly the Dunlop review. Could I ask you all how you would assess the changes in government relations, intergovernmental relations, since the review? Ms. Brady, would you like to start? I think you're muted.
So I would say that kind of since the different engagement, and I guess I've been in post for 2.5 years, so and I was external appointment to the civil service, so can I give the broader context? But I would say the relationship has remained continued and solid in terms of those relationships that we have established through both DLUC and through the Cabinet Office and through the NIO functions as well. And kind of to echo the points that were made by colleagues earlier in terms of the relationships, the formal structures that we have in place, but also those good relationships that have been built up through the pandemic and through the engagement from those many areas. I guess in terms of the NIO, they've had a really critical role in the past number of years with engagement with our departments and looking towards the budget settlement and addressing the issues in regard of the governance gap that we've had in the absence of ministers.
Thank you. Mr. Marks.
So, as I alluded to, I think, there's broad agreement that Dunlop Review and the new structures and process established following the separate IGR review were all positive developments. The Scottish Government agrees with the conclusion that there's a real importance to trust and transparency in the relationship between governments, so irrespective of the constitutional arrangements. I think ultimately UK Government colleagues will comment on specific recommendations, so senior cabinet position, new cabinet committee, UK-wide projects, joint ministerial committee. I mentioned staff interchange. I think that has improved and continues to improve. And I guess if I take my personal experience, I spent just under 20 years working in UK government departments, now in my third year here. So I think there is a good intent to embed the work on staff interchange in the spirit of what could be improved to make further progress, referencing those IGR mechanisms and structures. I think the IMC, the FISC, some of the other IMG structures, particularly around things like environment, food, rural affairs, meet pretty regularly. There's good structured engagement, deep understanding and collaboration. But for example, the top FM, the First Minister's, Prime Minister-led devolved government council in the Dunlop review and then in the IGR review, the view was that would meet annually. It's met once so far since 2022. So that's an opportunity going forwards to bring senior principals, ministers together on that annual basis to provide that focal point for shared endeavour, which works, to be fair, very well, IMSC and the FISC. I mean, the final point, obviously, and this is alluded to in previous evidence that you've considered, which I've read, Mr. Gove, clearly with his deep understanding of devolution, has played that pivotal role, and particularly, and it sort of explains the location of the Constitution Governance Group between the Cabinet Office and DLUC. And to an extent that's worked for us, but I can understand, going back to the Dunlop review, that is an open question for the future, which I'm sure colleagues will continue to reflect on in terms of the optimal location to leverage cross-government coordination to support devolution across 4 nations. Thanks.
Thank you. And Dr. Goodall.
Yeah, and just to JP's last point, I think that has created a regular contact and beat, recognising the location in DLUC. I agree that its location and where things should be in the future is a wider conversation than just ourselves. But I think that's given confidence with ministers about that beat, including the First Minister of Wales, who has regularly been part of those arrangements as well. but I think it's also helped us to form a relationship and liaise with colleagues at Permanent Secretary and also at the Director General level within DLUC as well. And I do feel that has been an advantage and an improvement over this last couple of years in particular. Just on your ask about general progress, probably important to call out that some of the practicalities of the machinery have actually been introduced because whilst the Dunlop Review put forward its recommendations, of course, we've been reliant on the intergovernment relations framework to be put in place. And whilst we've been using that machinery, of course, that's been until recent weeks and months with the absence of the Northern Ireland executive, although officials have, through Jayne, still been able to engage in that. So I think the ongoing use of that is really important. But as one example of how things can shape up a bit differently in there, the secretariat arrangements, which again was one of the recommendations, have been put in place. Actually, the secretariat is led by a Welsh government official. That was an appointment through an open competition. The Scottish government, colleagues involved in it. There'll be more other Welsh representation coming around that table as well. So it does allow us to start to show through our own mechanisms here that we are discharging those wider expectations for the way in which our liaison with other departments should work as well. But we do need to allow the machinery to settle in and to make sure that we are continuing to use that. And I would endorse JP's comment. I think it was really good to have that first contact of the overall council. But I think Dunlop actually suggested twice a year. We've not seen that frequency come through yet. And of course, that would be more a matter in liaison with First Ministers and other representatives.
Thank you. And the next question is from Damien Moore.
Thank you, Chairman. Good afternoon, panel. I'd like to talk about the role of individuals and how significant are the attitudes of ministers into shaping how officials between governments interact, and more importantly, how much notice they take of one another. If Ms Brady wants to answer that one first. You're just on mute
Again.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Moore. Apologies. My engagement obviously has been through the engagement predominantly with officials, and when we had no ministers in place, I attended, but obviously giving factual advice in terms of ministerial engagement. I guess note that in terms of reflections on the areas where there has been kind of further discussions, it's in a lack of awareness of perhaps the devolved structures within Northern Ireland and the role of myself as not a principal accounting officer, and the departmental structures within the Northern Ireland Civil Service, which are separate from the UK government rather than about personalities and relationships that they're in. I would say I've had a very positive relationship with all my officials and colleagues who have lent into the process that we have been in throughout this aspect. Obviously, we engaged very substantively with the Northern Ireland Secretaries of State, and we've had a number during the last number of years who again have had to take a governance level role within Northern Ireland setting the budget, but those have been very well engaged through the Northern Ireland office. We talked about we do not have interchange within the Northern Ireland Civil Service and the UK Civil Service in regard that we're separate legal entities, but we do have availability of secondments. But as a reflection of kind of that interchange of understanding and knowledge, one of our permanent secretaries of the Northern Ireland Civil Service has just recently taken up the role as permanent secretary for the Northern Ireland office. So establishing those core links intrinsically and knowing the actual implications of the Northern Ireland constitutional framework, but also those personalities and those engagements. And obviously, the Northern Ireland office is a very significant political context in terms of discussions that they've had for the restoration of the executive. So those formation of those knowledge is really important in my view in terms of addressing the restoration, but also the good running and effective governance and delivery of Northern Ireland as we go to set our programme for government and our budget going forward.
Thank you. Dr. Goodall, please.
Yes, just building on Jayne's comments, I said as one of my initial 4 criteria for how we would judge the success is that we need to be able to follow through on the commitment to the mechanisms. and I've seen myself some difference in those mechanisms. I've already called out that I think that the financial liaison that's occurred does seem to be one of those committees that has shown really good outcomes and a build-up of the structures and relationships. We, of course, from a UK civil service perspective, can expect and ensure that civil servants will liaise despite those mechanisms and have contact with each other. But inevitably, the environment in which we discharge those environments, can be affected by a commitment to some of the regularity of those meetings, perhaps some of the difficulties that will likely emerge in there, and we need to find a way of working those through. But what I would say that even in the most difficult examples at times, and when we're handling areas around legislation and some of those issues which require legislative consent, not from Welsh Government itself, but actually from the Welsh Parliament, Senedd Cymru, we do find that where there has been an openness and a transparency in liaising on those matters, including legislation, and when we are able to work jointly on those policy initiatives, or when we're able to land joint free port arrangements, that means that there is a co-production from UK government ministers alongside Welsh government ministers, we can make those things work very effectively as officials, because we take that kind of direction and we're able to support the expectations of our ministers together.
Thank you. And Mr. Marks.
Yeah, so ultimately leadership matters, doesn't it? And building those relationships and then creating that safe space for empowered teams to work together confidently, I think, is really important. If I take an example I alluded to briefly earlier in terms of the fiscal framework review that we agreed last August with the Treasury. My Deputy First Minister, Shona Robeson, said following, I'm very grateful to the Chief Secretary to the Treasury for reaching this deal. It demonstrates an ability to work with the UK government to find pragmatic solutions, willing to engage in a reasonable and genuinely collaborative way. That happened because Ms. Robeson, the Chief Secretary, but also her predecessors, Mr. Swinney, Ms. Forbes and others, having regular bilateral and multilateral engagements with Treasury colleagues. And that will happen around fiscal events, briefing on Barnett consequentials, changes in the fiscal position. And the more effort that is put into building those personal relationships, I think the higher level of trust, going back to those IGR principles, but then also critically that empowerment. So when there is a conflict and tension, there is also an encouragement for civil servants to work to resolve those in the interest of respective ministers. And, I do that pretty much on a daily basis, certainly on a weekly basis with my colleagues across 4 nations. And I think my ministers appreciate that effort because they know it's an important part of achieving their goals. Thanks.
Thank you. And just moving on from that, do you think more should be done to embed the consideration of devolution earlier in the Whitehall policy process? And do you also think it's getting better? So should more be done? Is it getting better? What's your overview of those? Ms. Brady, if you want to go first again, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think to disperse any issues coming to the fore, early engagement is critically important. We engaged last year in Devolution Week to provide a briefing on the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, and I think there is still a lack of awareness of the constitutional arrangement for Northern Ireland and the governance structure, which is fundamentally different from the role that JP and that Andrew have within their devolution settlement in kind of the very operational aspects, in that we are separate legal entities, in the lack of cabinet responsibility, which is necessary as part of a mandatory coalition, are separate legal departments and entities, and also the implications of what within a Northern Ireland context is central government and local government. If I take anecdotally looking at the shared prosperity funds and the levelling up funds, much of those were based on the model for GB, where, for example, housing authorities is entirely within an arm's length body of one of our departments, and there isn't a devolved housing authority. We have full, within our departments of infrastructure, control of our transport, our rail and our bus network, and indeed our water systems. So in terms of bidding for some of those projects as part of Levelling Up and Shared Prosperity, they were not initially open to departments to bid into those, even though that was the broader intent, as I understand, for those funds. So obviously that engagement, those were architected with the basis of a different structure. So the understand, it would be my view, those were entirely unintentional, but actually the early design of those to be architected to reflect the overall scope of what's that being delivered into. Obviously, our minister's view is that those funds which were replacing EU funding should have come through the Barnett formula in terms of a consequential and be delivered aligned with that policy intervention. And I would say some of the missions that were developed as well were perhaps not reflective of the challenges that we have in Northern Ireland, although many of our challenges in terms of productivity and inactivity are the same, but perhaps our view within those wasn't as accurately reflected. So I think there's the constitutional arrangements is one key aspect, but also where the line in terms of local government and central government line is very important and key. Obviously, we need now through the Windsor framework and the EU exit to have very close relationships in terms of the implications for that with particularly in our Department of Agriculture and Environment, and we're working really closely with DEFRA, really positive relationships in terms of giving effect to that legal now agreement, which is binding. And I guess that has been an example of early interaction, but actually that will require an enduring relationship as we continue to deliver on the implications of the Windsor framework.
Thank you. That was very useful. Dr. Goodall, please.
Yes, we're not at a standing start. We're obviously building up on contacts and interactions over many years, but we need to not be complacent on that. I came into Welsh Government back in 2014, and I think I recall that in early 2015 I was involved in, even at that point, doing presentations and sessions for wider civil service staff on my insight and understanding of devolved government from a Welsh Government perspective, and to share it. I think the Devolution and New programme that was introduced under Philip Rycroft, and we continue to use as the backlog to these areas, has been really useful to continue, and we've developed that into, amongst other contact points, a Devolution Learning Week. So really important there that we give exposure and access to colleagues on a range of different points. We've been able to be part of panels describing how we liaise and work with each other. But I think that beyond these labelled events, it's really important to make it mainstream that it is a daily experience in many respects of us doing business together. So when we have been participating in wider civil service developments, our civil service live sessions that occur right across the UK, for example, and how we liaise on those sorts of areas, I think it's been really important to show that whilst I've of course been at the Cardiff event last year, I'll be at the Newport event this year, to show that I'm there alongside other senior civil servants, other permanent secretary colleagues and wider staff groups. From a Wales perspective, in terms of understanding devolution, actually most of the civil servants in Wales are actually associated with other departments. We have 6,000 staff, but many other departments are located in Wales, discharging functions in Wales, and it's really important to bring together that network as well. But I do think some of the practical guidance that we have made available, so the devolution guidance, I do think it needs a bit of an upgrade, probably to account for post-COVID, post-EU exit, where we have lived through some more extraordinary events, perhaps, and it has been gently updated recently. But I do think some of the practical guidance that is on offer to general civil servants within our system that prompts them to think about when they would be thinking of asking for expertise or using contact points or approaching devolved administrations. Actually, there's some really good practical work there that can be picked up. So we don't just want this to be a conceptual conversation. Devolution is something that we're living, breathing every day. And obviously, from the three of our perspectives, devolution is something that we live every day because we're leading our respective organisations, of course.
Thank you very much for that. And Mr. Marks, please.
Yeah, so to address the question, first, I think always early engagement is helpful. So, yes. I think secondly, there are some good examples where it's improving. I alluded to some earlier. with regards to that integrated routine working together to deliver where we have that interdependency. Devolution of social security, income tax, green free ports, investment zones are good examples, and there are many others. Having said that, I think it is also happening in a disrupted and quite regularly contested political environment. And just to bring that to life a bit more, so my Cabinet Secretary for Constitution, External Affairs and Culture, Angus Robertson, wrote to the Scottish Affairs Committee in September 2023, where he sets out quite clearly the Scottish Government ministerial position with regards to that last point of is it improving, and that ministerial perspective is set out quite clearly that outside of the European Union, the UK Internal Market Act, and Jayne alluded to this with regards to shared prosperity funds, levelling up funds, and also common frameworks, has created a different operating environment to devolution compared to what went before. And you see that evidenced in the Sewell Convention and legislative consent. So up to 2018, the Sewell Convention, whereby the UK government would not legislate without consent from devolved governments in devolved areas, was always observed. And there were no circumstances where that consent was not granted, where the UK government would legislate without consent. But since 2018, there's been 11 occasions where that convention has not been followed. And so to an extent, that reflects a changing nature of the political context post-Brexit and given the UK Internal Market Act. And so I think to improve further, we need to settle into that operating environment and make those common frameworks work really well. And one of the best ways to do that is that early engagement and that clear common understanding of what we're seeking to achieve. So ultimately we can both respect the devolution settlement, but also support interoperability in the UK where it's necessary to do so. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Ronnie Cowan.
Thank you very much, Chair. We want to look at the responsibility for the Union and devolution. So what do you think has been the impact of the UK government moving responsibility for the Union and devolution from the Cabinet Office to the Department for Levelling Up, Housing and Communities? I can start with Mr. Marks on that, please.
So I work very closely with DLUC colleagues, so Sarah Healy, the Perm Sec there, Brendan Threnfall, the second Perm Sec, and genuinely hold them in very high regard. And clearly, Michael Gove, as Secretary of State, has a very deep understanding of both Scotland and devolution, and is regularly, a key principal minister at the heart of the IGR engagements with Scottish ministers. So I have not observed a downside to date from the move, but clearly one of the reasons, or I'm not particularly party to this, but is the move works because of the individuals involved and their deep experience. Jayne can say far better than I can about the way in which that worked well with the Windsor Framework and that collaboration with Northern Ireland. But yes, I talk to DLUC colleagues. We meet, Andrew, Jayne, Brendan, every fortnight, and we can regularly escalate if we've got an issue or concern. So that does work well. I suppose ultimately the opportunity has been at the heart of government in the Cabinet Office is that leverage with the Prime Minister, with Number 10, with CDL and across government rapidly. I suspect to an extent, given Michael Gove's role in the UK government, that is still enabled well. But it's something to continue to develop and keep an eye on, and I'm sure Simon and the team will continue to keep it under review. Thanks.
I'm wondering, you've mentioned Mr. Gove a couple of times there, and also the good working relationship you've got with the people in his department. But I'm asking, is that the right department? And if these were the same people working in the Cabinet Office, you could be saying the same thing. In the long term, people will move on. Is the department DLUC the right place to have this particular role?
Yeah, I don't know that I have a definitive answer for you.
It's okay. You don't have to have. That's fine. I'm fine.
No, do you know what I mean? On the one hand, I do think there is a lot to be said for trying to mainstream devolution into business as usual, so it works as routine in the way in which we work with government departments. So if I'm dealing with a fiscal event, I'm working bilaterally with the Treasury. If I'm dealing with a common framework issue to do with single-use plastics, my team are working directly with DEFRA. The idea of it necessarily operating through a central function to then be coordinated sometimes actually adds delay and risk. And I want to build those integrated governance arrangements. And so mainstreaming is perhaps more important to me than where the unit sits. But I agree there's a risk that the unit might lose its leverage and impact if it's not kept under careful review with good senior leadership. But to date, my view is that it's worked well. Thanks.
Thank you. I think Ms. Brady, you were looking to come in there, were you?
Yes, I'm very happy to come in. I guess my experience has been briefly before it was devolved to DLUC when Sue Gray was in post. Obviously, Sue had a very significant knowledge of Northern Ireland, having been Department of Finance Permanent Secretary here. And then integrated then the transfer between Cabinet Office and DLUC. I would say it's about the people and the relationships, of which those have all been very strong. I worked closely with Sarah, and I was indeed asked to be an appointing panel for the second Perm Sec for DLUC. I would say in terms of, we have had a significant engagement because the UK government and the NIO and DLUC have had a significant role in terms of the restoration of the executive and indeed the governance in the absence of an executive in the last couple of years. And it has been seamless to me. There has been representatives, obviously key individuals within DLUC leading some of those discussions and negotiations with representation from number 10 team in the Cabinet Office and indeed NIO, and I have always felt I've known the pathway through that system, and there has been a collaborative aspect to drive that forward, and indeed the Simon Case has also been engaged in terms of that process. Indeed, he was supposed to be here last week in terms of supporting those initiatives. So albeit Northern Ireland is one of the smaller, or it is the smallest DA, there has been an availability to actually leverage that overall collective aspect to support those areas and issues. So I haven't seen the restructuring to be a core issue in itself, that the delivery and functions has been there to support during that period as well.
The committee has received strong criticism from the Northern Ireland Department of Finance regarding the performance of DLUC. They said the devolution capability remains a significant concern. They also said there's been some improvement with the devolution within DLUC. It does not go far enough, and it does not appear that lessons are being learned or applied. Do you recognise that?
Yes, I think it refers to my comments that were made earlier and the correspondence, obviously, that the Department of Finance Minister has made in that regard. It calls out the understanding of the local government versus central government position in terms of administrating of those funds. Initially, in the structuring of those funds, they did not allow departments to bid into them. That has now been opened up to Department for Infrastructure.
I'm going to come back in a minute, but if I maybe like to Mr. Goodall answer my initial question before I push on.
Yeah, I recognise from both a perception and also in terms of the benefits, how that call for the central role around Cabinet Office can really work. Obviously, that was a very clear recommendation from Dunlop at the time. I think if you were offering me a binary choice between shifting to the Cabinet Office oversight or securing departmental capability and understanding of devolution, I think I would choose the departmental understanding, because there is a danger of almost having a false assurance sometimes by some of those central coordinating roles, when what we're trying to do, hopefully through our own evidence, is to find a way in which this is simply mainstreamed in respect of the understanding of how we interact across those devolved and reserved responsibilities. In respect of the DLUC experience, like other colleagues have said, we've worked with the structures that are there. I found that very effective, liaising with officials and working through. We have two different and potentially frustrating experiences maybe as we handle there. On the one hand, I think we've got a really positive template liaising on free ports, investment zones, where we've managed to demonstrate that we can bring together a Welsh Government perspective with UK Government and actually, as officials, be directed jointly to get on with those arrangements to really good outcomes. Welsh ministers have expressed some of their frustration on the way in which the shared prosperity fund arrangements have worked in respect to co-design, co-production approach and co-decision making to happen in the right way. But I think we have sufficient examples of what really works when we're trying to blend together the best and make confidence in those mechanisms and share them more widely as well.
There is an argument that the Department for Levelling Up is using the long-term plans for towns to bypass the devolved powers, and in doing so is undermining the attempts to create a better working relationship between the UK Government and devolved powers. Do you recognise this? Anybody? First come, first served.
Yeah, it's JP Marks here. Well, I think I alluded to the reference to Angus Robertson's correspondence from the autumn. I think he would agree with that concern. And Scottish Government ministers have regularly expressed their preference. The Shared Prosperity Fund, the Levelling Up funds, rather than being direct to local government, should come via devolved governments, and that would enable a more strategic coherence given our role in economic development, regional development, and housing and transport and all the rest of it. So that is our preference as a Scottish Government, and it clearly is one of the opportunities for the future. But currently, given the approach that is taken, we seek to make the best of the approach that is in place, and that is particularly about saying where funds are allocated into local communities, for example, can they then be pooled and work well within city deals, regional growth deals, as best possible. Thanks.
It would be a very similar experience from a Welsh Government perspective. We have other examples of joint mechanisms that can work very effectively. So the city deals arrangements that bring together stakeholders alongside respective governments, has worked well. We've been able to deploy that successfully. I mentioned the Freeport example. I've been in the room with the former First Minister of Wales as he's talked through how he would wish that it was more of a co-design process. But in some respects, the offer I think that has been missed potentially in that has that, as JP was saying, we've been unable to line up other resources that may well be available to the same outcomes and to the same effect. So probably we are diluting some of the available funding that is available from all partners in Wales on some of these individual areas. So just thought it was worth giving you that impression, having heard it from the First Minister of Wales, for example.
Thanks. Anything to add? Ms. Brady?
Thank you. I guess I would just kind of summarise some of the points made regarding the early engagement in terms of understanding. We talked about some of the funds that were mentioned and the correspondence that was made in evidence from the Finance Minister in Northern Ireland, but those were calling out regarding kind of systems and funding structures which were designed as proposed, would not necessarily understanding the full implications of the Northern Ireland constitutional arrangement, but also our local government and central government aspects.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Tom Randall.
Thank you, Chairman. A couple of questions on the role of territorial officers in the UK governance group, if I may. Can you explain how and when your respective administrations deal with the territorial officers? If I could start with John Paul Marks, please.
So a few examples. One of them is very clearly in that ceremonial position. I was at Edinburgh Castle the other day for the ceremony for the movement of the Stone of Destiny with Alistair Jack and the First Minister. and there will be regular joint attendance to ceremonial events for the Secretary of State of Scotland and Scottish Government ministers. The second thing would regards going back to that point around Sewell Convention and legislative consent. So the Scotland office will play that role in relation to the legislative programme and working closely with my Scottish Government Parliament legislation unit on matters regarding the LCMs and Scotland Act orders. And they will be part of that liaison also with that, the government department that is owning that legislation. And then the final element perhaps that I would draw out is in resilience situations. If, for example, we wanted to seek military assistance, then we would engage first with our Scotland Office colleagues for their support in engaging with the MOD. And my resilience team have very regular catch-ups with the Scotland Office to talk about threats and risks to national security or security here in Scotland, and to make sure we've got that good engagement going on. Thanks.
Dr. Goodall.
Yep, there is a regular liaison with the Wales office. So that is accessed by officials on both sides to talk to each other, often sharing issues, concerns, using that local intelligence, if I could put it in that way, and making sure we can align very much on that. I have a regular contact with the head of the Wales office, just so that we can maintain our open dialogue and conversations where needed. To some extent, however, the issues that we're handling can often tend to be more directly with individual departments. So in terms of rolling the sleeves up and getting on to broker arrangements, come together with similar understandings and get some actions in place, that will tend to be where myself and officials in Welsh Government will be more liaising with the individual UK government departments more directly rather than via the territorial offices. That doesn't stop the liaison, including on areas of legislation, for example, where it's just worth having the transparent conversation and seeing whether we can liaise and work on those issues together. But I think it probably is more effective sometimes working on those departments. And I should say, maybe to explain as well, we do ourselves, from a devolved administration perspective, get together every fortnight with UK government colleagues. That has allowed us to build up our own relationship amongst each other and to liaise there. But we're not necessarily in those settings collectively alongside the other territorial offices, even if there is a direct contact between myself and the Wales office or JP and Scottish office colleagues, etc. So maybe that's something that we can reflect on a bit further.
Thank you. Jayne, Brady, if you want to add.
Thank you. And I perhaps touched on some of these points earlier in the role that Northern Ireland office has, which is different. I imagine Scotland and Wales in the political context. And the collapse of devolution during the last number of years in particular. And most engagement that we would have had through the service has been in the context of the operation of those devolved institutions, rather than the kind of more bread and butter governmental issues. As Andrew's referenced, those mostly would be through either DLUC or indeed the specific departments, DEFRA, DERA, for example, and the relevant lead Whitehall departments where that operation is very good. There is obviously a role within the Secretary of State for our intergovernmental reviews, the British Irish Council, and most recently last month the establishment of the East-West Council, and that will be alongside the DLUC Minister as well, so it'll be interesting to see what the role develops in terms of that context. I'd say kind of the positive aspect, really critical role in terms of the political talks and facilitation of that process, alongside bringing in and engaging Whitehall colleagues and in DLUC and in the Cabinet Office, and the arrangement for the decision-making, very complex issues for decision-making and governance, and an understanding of the implications for departments, which was key in the absence of ministers. Obviously, it put civil servants in very difficult positions during that context. I guess in the areas that maybe kind of towards more tension, it would be in the areas where there's potential overlap between those devolved sphere For example, economic policy is within the Northern Ireland Civil Service, but there is departments of prosperity, and those are maybe the areas of tension that do occasionally arise. On a personal level, I have very good relationships with colleagues. I actually had appointed the individual who's now the Perm Sec of NIO as Perm Sec within my department before she moved 6 months ago. So very good relationship. We would have regular weekly engagements, which is very helpful in terms of addressing the real-time situation, but also de-escalating issues and addressing them as early as we can.
In the evidence that the three of you have given so far, you've spoken often about the sort of direct dealings you've had with various government departments across Whitehall. In evidence to us, Sir David Livington and Lil Dunlop told us that the territorial office ministers play an important role in representing the three nations in the UK government. Would you say that they still serve or do you have any reflection on that they serve that valuable role in representing the respective nations?
Mr. Marks first, please.
Mr. Marks, sorry.
Well, so if I think, if I was sat inside the UK cabinet, then does the Secretary of State for Scotland represent Scotland in that forum, in that conversation? Then I presume from the Prime Minister's perspective he does, and he provides that voice to reflect Scotland's interests, what's going on here, and to provide that informed opinion and view to his colleagues around the cabinet table, and he can do that with some of his other colleagues as well, given their backgrounds and experience growing up or living in Scotland too. So yes, I think as Mr. Lidington was alluding to, that is one of the roles and reasons for the territorial offices and secretaries of state that represent those communities. The reason I paused was the point about, do they represent devolved governments in their articulation of the view? And I think it's clearly a matter of record that there have been points of tension and conflicts where there has not always been agreement, clearly at a ministerial and political level. An example would be the use of Section 35 under the Scotland Act with regards to the Gender Recognition Act and the subsequent legal case that followed. And there are other examples. So yes, I think it performs that role, but do they represent the views of devolved governments in those forums? I suspect that is where the IGR mechanisms are important, so that the First Minister and his cabinet can represent themselves directly, because that is what they would always seek and wish to do. Thanks.
Thank you. Dr. Goodall.
Yeah, there will be others who have a direct experience of that representation. I've not had it myself, but yes, of course, I would expect them to be representing perspectives from Wales and with their own responsibilities. I do agree with JP that I don't see how that would translate into representing devolved responsibilities, because that's the whole basis of devolution and what we've been experiencing over the last 25 years. But I know that when the interministerial meetings have been taking place, when we've been using the IGR mechanism, when we were brokering contact through the pandemic response and using some of these mechanisms with that contact point. I've heard the Secretary of State say that, Michael Gove declare that he will take away those issues and ensure that they are represented around the cabinet table. And I felt that was discharged in that manner because it was a commitment that was given through those IGR mechanisms. But this is where I go back to my earlier point, where the regularity of the contact and the importance of those mechanisms being, meeting with a pattern, is really important so that those views can be represented where appropriately. And of course, there is a very direct opportunity for those issues to be represented around the council arrangements with the Prime Minister in the chair and with the other First Ministers and representatives, of course.
Thank you. And Jayne Brady, if you have anything to add to that at all.
Yes, I concur with the points that were made by JP and Andrew. I'll also raise, obviously we have a different constitutional arrangement under the Belfast Good Friday Agreement and different institutionals, different assembly, different executive structure, our First Minister and the executive would say that it's through that representation that they represent, those parties are elected and entitled to form that executive, and they represent the people of Northern Ireland in that regard. And that devolution settlement is really important to be respected. In the situation where there was no ministers or indeed an executive, and we needed to have a governance mechanism for setting the budget, the Secretary of State had an important role in terms of providing that governance function. Obviously, that was based on the input to him from our departments and our senior civil servants. But just to echo the points as well, we would see that the devolved settlement is here and led by the ministers within our executive office.
Thank you. And just moving on, and if I could start with you, Jayne Brady, for my next question. From your perspective, how has the UK governance group established by Philip Rycroft affected your interactions with Whitehall?
Sorry, could you repeat the question? Apologies.
Yes, certainly. From your perspective, how has the UK governance group established by Philip Rycroft affected your interaction?
I haven't seen any particular implications regarding the establishment of that group to the continuation of our relationship with Whitehall. As it said, our contacts predominantly are through the DLUC, through the NIO, and through our connections along with the DAs. So I'm not in a position to comment as to the implications of that.
Thank you. Dr. Goodall?
I said that I've not sat around that mechanism myself, so the representation of ourselves in our permanent secretary roles hasn't happened. That doesn't mean that we don't represent those issues in other fora. I think the fortnightly contact that we have coordinated amongst ourselves with DLUC has been really important. I think that has had an impact on the way in which we have, as officials, liaised on devolution matters and issues and maintained the communication more generally. I would also say the way in which we engage and are part of the arrangements alongside other permanent secretary colleagues in their regular meetings, that also ensures that we're able to give those representative devolved administration perspectives around the table in those fora when relevant, rather than only being there when there is a devolution item. So I really welcome those more generally, but the mechanism that you've described is probably translated into other things, and I personally don't use that as my own guide for liaising.
Okay, thank you. And John Paul Marks.
So I suppose just a couple of extra points. Certainly in my time as Perm Sec in the Scottish Government, certainly in that first year, I had a lot of interaction with Sue Gray and with Jayne and Andrew, and that was located in the Cabinet Office. I think more akin to what Philip would like to see. I had a look at his evidence to you and his concerns around the need to build long-term capabilities and to develop a strategic approach to devolution. And I would agree with him that for us as a civil service, those are important things to do. And for and it is a reflection for you, I think, as a committee and for my colleagues in Whitehall to reflect on what happens next with regards to that. We've already covered the points with regards to the move to DLUC, but clearly 25 years into devolution, the question of what does the next 25 years look like and how we navigate the future should be informed by deep capability and thinking, and that will come from building the capabilities that Mr. Rycroft alludes to. So I can see why, I think he used the word mourns the loss of the group as he first envisaged it, and I think he would probably like to see it return more to the way in which he led that group. And clearly he did it at a time where that central cohesion and coordination was pivotal, given the Smith Commission, given the referendum, and then given Brexit and the role he took on later as well. So for someone who spent his whole career almost advocating the importance of this capability, I can understand quite clearly why he continues to see it as a pivotal capability for the future. And for someone who leads a civil service team in a devolved government, I would of course support that thinking, because the more deep and expert the understanding, the more effective, hopefully, we will be at ensuring good government across 4 nations. Thanks.
Well, thank you. And if I could just stay with you, John Paul Motts, for my final question, is that Lord Dunlop recommended there should be a single permanent secretary for the UK governance group, which would include a Northern Ireland office, supported by shared services and a central policy function. I just wondered if you had any reflections on that. And also, Philip Rycroft and Sue Gray served as a second permanent secretary to that group, and I wondered if you'd support the appointment of a civil servant of a similar status.
Yeah, so Brendan Threnfell, who now leads this in Whitehall, is a second permanent secretary now, as Jayne referenced earlier. I think sat on that panel. But look, the sort of Lord Dunlop, Philip Rycroft hypothesis is you need central leadership, coordination, deep capability, and even if you might feel like you don't need it today because it's mainstreamed and a bit more stable than what it once was, you might need it for the future. So invest for the long haul. That is ultimately a decision for the Prime Minister and the Cabinet Secretary. As I said, from my experience in the last year or so since the move and since Sue Gray's departure and Brendan stepping into the role, is that it has worked well. But I take the point that was made earlier, is that more to do with personalities than optimal structures? And I think that is the right question that needs good consideration. Long term, ultimately, I'd quite like a balance of both. Central deep capability with senior leadership, with representation right at the top of the civil service, which, as Andrew said earlier, I experience. I sit, for example, on the civil service board for the UK civil service, and Andrew, Jayne and I attend Wednesday morning colleagues, for example, with Simon and the senior team. So we do bring that leadership to the top of the civil service. But similarly, I want to see that integration on delivery across departments, because I think it's in the day-to-day working, whether that be tax, social security, energy consenting, grid connection, or whatever, where we get the work done. And actually, it's the work that makes the biggest difference to improving outcomes day to day, which has been my main focus in the last couple of years. Thanks.
Thank you. Dr. Goodall, I wonder if you had any reflections on those points.
Yes, I do. If I refer back to my earlier comments, I think there is a danger of chasing a structural answer rather than securing the intention of that arrangement as well. So, for example, if this was to lead to the territorial offices acting as a buffer or an intermediary in respect of the way in which we interact with other departments, which has been quite a direct experience, I don't think that would necessarily help. If they were able to adopt more of an enabling issue, which is kind of the relationship we build up with them at the moment, that when we spot issues, we can use them, in the general conversations and progress that's happening, I think that's fine. But I'm more interested in not going down a centralised route if what it means is it undermines the underlying understanding of departments about the balance of devolved and reserved matters and how we can make sure we secure that capability. And I think that's actually the wider objective that we're looking to achieve here, rather than just a centralisation again in our structures.
Finally, Jayne Brady, if you had anything to add to that.
Thank you. Echoing some of the points that previously made, my view would be its form, I guess its function before the form of that structure. So key for me in terms of our engagement is having official level individuals who understand and have an interest in the devolved administration, particularly in Northern Ireland. And we have had that with the individuals that we've worked at, whatever department they have been engaged in. We had a changeover within the NIO at a PermSec level, and actually I take it as a very positive sign that a PermSec from our department has moved in a substantive post into the Northern Ireland office, because it's that degree of corporate knowledge of Northern Ireland and the implications and what works. Some things of those aren't written down or can't be handed over. In terms of a structure, they're about relationships and inbuilt knowledge. And I guess I would propose that as a positive sign of UKG appointing someone in who has the knowledge of the place within Northern Ireland, which can support us then deal with the many issues that we have going ahead. So I would have seen the relationships I've had have been solid and positive. Obviously there are challenges in any role, and we have challenges in Northern Ireland as there is in my colleagues Scotland and Wales, and there are ultimately decisions for our ministers to make. Our job is to be impartial and provide that impartial advice, and that's also to do with the structures and the context of which they're operating in Northern Ireland element, which I discussed earlier, and I would say those have largely been in place. Whether there's a role for a centralised structure, or whether that's individuals regarding responsibility from the from DLUC, I mean that's ultimately for the UK government to decide how those should be best placed.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you. The next questions are from John McDonnell.
Can we talk about the performance of individual government departments? And I don't want to destroy your relationships with your colleagues in Whitehall, but hardly anyone's listening to us, so you can be completely candid anyway. Okay. So how would you assess the performance of different government departments in engaging with your administrations? And are there any particular good examples? Andrew, do you want to start?
Yes, thank you. So yeah, there are positive and good relations. I can confirm, not least from operational contact, about the good relations that are in place with the Department of Health and Social Care. That continues to be used to good effect. Obviously, there's a lot of sharing of information about respective health policies, but actually there are areas where UK government leads on behalf of Wales on a range of areas, and it's really important that we're able to secure those. I referred earlier to our experience of liaising with DEFRA. I think that's an area where there is the potential to feel like we are stumbling across each other in that environment, but actually throughout the course of devolution, I think that relationship has worked pretty effectively. I said earlier there are some networks in place that probably help to secure that, but I actually think there are a range of sort of common areas of interest from a policy perspective as well that secure that too. Actually, I would say our liaison and dealings from a Welsh Government perspective with the Foreign and Commonwealth and Development Office, actually that's a positive experience from a Welsh Government perspective. The support for ministers when they are away discharging international activities has always been very supportive and appropriate. We have got Welsh Government officials who actually work in offices internationally rather than set up ourselves. And we've seen some really good use of ambassador networks. I mean, most recently on liaison on matters around Japan. I had a contact myself, which was really pleased to see, but actually in other respects as well. So a really key issue for Wales with our first attendance at the World Cup for a significant number of years was the opportunity to raise some of the international profile about Wales. And I know First Minister was very complimentary about the role of the FCDO and the UK ambassador to Qatar, for example, just about consolidating those arrangements. So you might not have been expecting that example, but I think that's actually been genuinely a pretty positive relationship over recent years as well.
Anything that secures football match tickets, I can understand an appreciation of that. But you mentioned earlier the issue, one example was the issue of the Home Office. actually reflects what David Lidington said to us about that. Where there's reserved matters in departments, that's less effective a relationship as a result of that. But you also mentioned the Treasury earlier. And the Senate's Finance Committee, its comments on Whitehall departments, particularly the Treasury, it cited the Treasury's lack of engagement with the Welsh government ahead of significant funding announcements. Is that still the case?
Yeah, so if I could use the two examples, if you don't mind. In respect of the Home Office engagement, there are many examples where we liaise very effectively, not least on policing matters. That's a pretty fundamental area, although reserved where we are liaising with police as partners around the table in Wales. So there are many good examples of the way in which that is discharged. It's almost a technicality on, I think, the way in which some of the asylum accommodation worked, because we have IGR mechanisms in place that are absolutely clear about confidentiality and the way in which we would discharge issues together ahead of announcements and hopefully work through on the practicalities. It's simply that if there are arrangements happening in Wales, we're sort of dealt with as a stakeholder rather than as a devolved government under the IGR. And in some respects, it doesn't allow us to sit alongside the table with colleagues, perhaps in as transparent a way as they would liaise with the Department of Health and Social Care at UK government level and liaise. So I just think we need to break through that, because the confidentiality is really secured, I think, by the IGR mechanisms. From a Treasury perspective, if I just comment over the last 12 to 18 months, perhaps, but yes, there's been contact via the Chief Secretary to the Treasury alongside the Finance Ministers. That has allowed for some early sight, appropriately so, in my view, of likely issues that will impact on Wales. From an official's perspective, I've been really pleased that in the fortnightly meetings that we have already described here today, actually whenever there are budget and Treasury announcements happening, we have an opportunity to speak to Treasury officials within that mechanism. And of course, if there are some more significant areas, then all of us can approach the Permanent Secretary for the Treasury and have that open conversation as well. But from a ministerial perspective, there was advice that was given through those more formalised interministerial contacts and meetings. Yes.
Yeah. JP?
Thank you. So look, it's a great question, which I will not dodge, because that's not helpful. So, I mean, I wrote down some opportunities, I guess, for even better if. One example, I think, for us, which we want to encourage, is for the engagement to be purposeful, where we are trying to shift the dial on a problem. I alluded earlier to the Islands Forum. The UK government arranged for Ofgem to join that forum once in the past, and that led to a very good, positive, supportive conversation about how to improve grid connectivity, which is a key enabler for us to deliver ScotWind and to realise the benefits of onshore-offshore wind. So we would like to see more of that type of purposeful engagement where we're trying to particularly solve a problem. An example, you alluded to the point around migration earlier. Some communities in Scotland, like in Argyll and Bute, other island communities too, face a serious concern around depopulation. And so targeted migration reforms are a real opportunity there, but it's quite hard to get that tailoring and targeting up the agenda given the wider UK debate about immigration. So again, opportunity for the future. I referenced levelling up, shared prosperity, where we find that approach can be quite tactical and very localised, and we would prefer to see it align with devolution and integrate into established effective collaborative structures like city deals and regional growth. And finally, I alluded to the Seoul Convention, where consent has been withheld. And I think often that occurs when events are moving very quickly and or there's a political contention that is unresolved. And that's where those IGR mechanisms are very important. And we've had experiences, if I take things like recently, the Strikes Act and minimum service levels legislation, which appeared quite late on our radar, and our ministers had significant concerns, which they've been very public and open about. So it goes back again to your point earlier about early engagement, particularly when things are contentious, so that they can be resolved rather than late engagement that might actually escalate conflict. So I guess I've given some examples there where there's opportunities to improve the way we work well, particularly with the objective of improving outcomes for the communities we all serve. Thanks.
Thanks. Jayne.
Thank you. Maybe to give a positive example, in some departments, and I guess we're an area that we had some issues previously. If we look towards the DLUC position, as it was then in the Levelling Up funds, the engagement we had, we'd worked in terms of providing input into what the structures were, indeed what our missions are in terms of productivity, net zero, those key aspects, and those weren't reflected in the first iterations of the Levelling Up funds and iterations. I would say in a reflection as where we are now as part of our restoration proposal, there is the proposition for free ports in the perspective of an investment zone, which has been, we have worked yet to be delivered, but worked with DLUC to provide that around the framework which makes sense within a Northern Ireland economic context, with our GVA's challenges with productivity, with our skills challenges with immigration to net zero. So better aligned in terms of our policy direction that our ministers have set. They would equally say that should also be in the context of coming through the Barnett consequential formula. I guess, and probably a reflection in terms of our different constitutional arrangements, each department, unless the issue is cross-cutting or has executive approval, would liaise directly with their department within UKG, so that would not come through necessarily the position of the executive. And you've seen the correspondence from the Department of Finance Minister in terms of the issues they have raised. I would say there has been very substantive engagement in terms of DEFRA and DERA on the outworkings of the Windsor framework. We provided fully 5 people were seconded from our Department of Agriculture into DEFRA to support the delivery of the outworkings of the Windsor framework. So I guess a very integrated model, recognising the complexity for delivery, but also the importance of giving effect to the Windsor framework and its legal under legal obligations and statutory obligations.
The individual departments have their devolution teams. Some of them are teams. Some departments, we're told there's even just one officer, one civil servant. Just going round again, have you noticed an impact, a positive impact from the devolution teams? Jayne?
I haven't noticed a difference in terms of the engagement. That hasn't been reported to me. I mean, our officials work very proactively in terms of behind the scenes and those further engagements. So it hasn't been noted to me as a detriment or a difference to be commented on.
JP?
Yeah, so I have, and I think there are some really exceptional colleagues who lead on devolution in the different departments. And I alluded to a few earlier. HMRC work very closely with us. For example, if we want to change our income tax system and we need to impact different scenarios, they do that at an official level. And of course, that is quite politically sensitive work, and they do it with a high degree of trust and confidence, which we really appreciate. We talked about the importance of building relationships. I mean, in the last few years, Tamara Finkelstein has brought her senior leadership team here to Edinburgh so we could have a joint away day on energy reform. Peter Schofield from DWP has done the same thing on social security devolution. We do that as an annual sort of summit. We bring our teams together to make sure we're on track. And there are other examples. FCDO recently, Sir Philip Barton and I have done a bunch of events together, visiting sites both in Scotland and then in Whitehall, including with the whole ambassador network, to ensure that the collaboration on the ground is as good as it can be, given the environment that we're operating in. So yes, I think those devolution teams are really essential to make sure the relationships are in place. They're going those extra miles to build those relationships, preferably face-to-face, so it has a level of deep trust to it. And then, as I've said before, it's in the way of working, like with HMRC on tax, where we build a competence and capability over time to ensure that things are delivered as they must be to deliver good public services. Thanks.
Andrew?
Yeah, it's difficult to comment on the individual teams, but we can certainly comment about seeing departments ask questions about devolution areas and policy side. We've also got our own versions of that. So my constitutional unit in Welsh Government is also available to support colleagues from UK government departments if they need to translate and have some understanding of those areas in general terms. But I think definitely on some matters of legislation, we had some earlier notice of some of the draft legislative proposals associated with the King's speech. I thought that departments did lean into us a bit differently in that process. Some of the outcomes we saw around the procurement legislation that took place recently, that felt as though that had been directed to sort of liaise with us differently. And I thought the outcome was much more successful. And actually, we were able to use the UK government legislative process to make sure that provision was made appropriately for Wales in that area. So it sort of worked both ways as well.
Yeah. Can we just turn the question round then and start with you, Andrew? How would you assess the capability of the devolved administration as you actually lead in dealing with Whitehall and each other? And do the different structures of your respective government departments affect those interactions?
So since I've come into role, maybe even I've been surprised myself about the extent to which I've been personally involved in the interactions. A lot of that with the permission and support from the former First Minister and an expectation that we do have those effective relationships in place. I thought for a moment you might ask us whether we thought we had some devolved expertise ourselves, and of course my answer to that would be, well, I would hope so, after 25 years of discharging it. But I do think that we recognise the need for us to be active in that and for us to reach out to our other colleagues. I think JP's description of making sure that we have more regular contacts on issues with other departmental teams, that feels important as well. But I also feel that I don't really need to over-interfere in those contacts because officials from Welsh Government are able to make some of their own decisions about how they want to interact with those departments. You know, I used to have a relationship when I was the Director General for Health and Social Care with the Permanent Secretary of the Department of Health and Social Care, for example, and we need to maintain those arrangements. But yeah, I do agree that it works both ways, and we have a responsibility to make the best of that relationship for ourselves as well.
Now, the point you make about your own experience over 25 years, some of the concerns that have been expressed to us is the lack of experience that there is now within the devolved administrations, the lack of experience within Whitehall itself, and whether that's a generational loss.
Yeah, well, there may be something there. So I've got 5 Directors General reporting directly into me, 3 of whom actually have had significant experience of Whitehall, and I see that as positive in respect of the mix of experiences. There are other colleagues who bring a very strong experience of course, working in Wales and in public services more generally. You know, I come myself outside of the traditional civil service route, and hopefully that adds to this as well. But I think to secure the future generations, we need to maintain some of the work around exchange programmes and maintain that. So we have both UK government colleagues working in our functions and responsibilities, and we actually have Welsh government officials who are working in the reverse order as well. So I think securing the confidence of those individuals that they can bring direct experience to the table, as well as having been trained up and developed in matters of devolution, is going to be really important.
JP?
Yeah, so agree with that. And, you know, I think this interchange does really matter. So my Chief Finance Officer, for example, formerly of DFID, has a deep understanding of the way in which Treasury accounts works, and works very well with the Treasury. My DG Economy is former Chief Economist of FCDO. And I've got a large proportion of my team have come from HMRC, DWP, the Home Office, those departments to have a large presence in Scotland. I mean, we do a number of things to improve that understanding of Whitehall and how things are changing. Internal Market Act Toolkit, for example, we launched to help people make sure they understand common frameworks and how to work well together. Our policy profession team, a number of modules on multi-level government and how to interact effectively. And then just this final point that I've been emphasising about continuing to build the relationship so we don't sort of retreat into our bubbles when things get difficult. whereas actually our default should be to lean towards each other when things are harder, to find common endeavour. And that, I think, is one of the things I'm working on and encouraging my teams to do, and to get down to Whitehall on a regular basis and meet their colleagues and work through the issues and understand different ministers' perspectives, and then see if we can find and understand the opportunities in that. So it's a constant work in progress, but I'm impressed with the quality of the civil service in the Scottish Government. It's got deep capability, and a lot of colleagues have come from Whitehall departments and understand them well. Thanks.
Jayne?
Thank you. I think Northern Ireland Civil Service are generally well aware of where they sit in the constitutional arrangements and the role from the law policy and their responsibility. Obviously, there are some areas like road service and maintenance, which we provide as part of the Northern Ireland Civil Service, which do not require that cross-cutting elements as well, so on a needs basis. I would say within departments, there is a very strong awareness of who they engage with at their counterparts in those departments, and there is strong engagement in that area. We provide learning and development to all Northern Ireland Civil Service with all 9 modules to kind of explain the context of where we are within the UKG, and indeed the strands that we have as part of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. Strand 1 is our assembly, the East-West and the North-South ministerial aspect, and the East-West, the British-Irish Council. So those are key aspects in terms of the executive itself and the assembly. I'd say the areas that I think there are for more development in Northern Ireland Civil Service at an official level, we're trying to be more externally faced and more open for representation within the civil service. I probably am a reflection of that, having come in from a background in business and technology a couple of years ago, but equally how we can look towards an interchange, that looking towards bringing those skills both from UK civil service and indeed Republic of Ireland civil service and internationally in those different skills mix. And some areas that specialisation that we need as we deliver equally, substantively complex policy developments. We do not have the facility because we are a separate legal entity. The Northern Ireland Civil Service was established in 1920. Indeed, it was established by Irish civil servants when Northern Ireland was established. So our pedigree is somewhat different. So our support in terms of staffing into UKG and to the ground is various secondment opportunities, but I would really very much welcome an opportunity to look towards what frameworks there could be to identify those skills gaps. In one of our British Irish Council meetings, we looked toward that as a framework, and I know that our people teams throughout the representatives of the BIC are working towards a framework proposal which would allow that level of secondment of East-West and North-South and indeed the other representatives as well, which I think actually towards where we started the conversation an hour and a half ago was about establishing those relationships, that good working and that knowledge of the implications of what the issues are within the DA, but also knowing who can reach out to in those areas which are cross-cutting and which we need engagement at a UKG level.
Very helpful, thank you.
Thank you. And Jayne, if I could just continue on that point, you just mentioned, of course, that the Northern Ireland Civil Service is a separate legal entity. Lord Maud's recent report said that this was an issue that needed to be resolved one way or the other, that is, having a separate civil service for Northern Ireland, separate from those for Great Britain. What do you think of that view expressed by Lord Maud? Do you think he's right? And if so, how could that disparity be ended?
So, of course, any discussion of the constitutional arrangements for Northern Ireland would be for those who are elected to make that decision. We reflected last year the 25th anniversary of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, which established the 3 strands which make in our constitution, and those have delivered a step change in life outcomes for the people in Northern Ireland. Not only have they brought us peace after our conflicting troubled past, but they also have allowed us to drive through local devolution and policy a transformation in our economy, in our services, and placed us in a much stronger footing. I guess the information and the facts is that we were established in 1920 at the time of creation of Northern Ireland, and those first civil servants were established as part of a development from Dublin Castle. We have not only a separate, in terms of civil service and employer, in the Department of Finance, who are employers of civil servants in Northern Ireland, are 23,000 staff, but there are indeed 9 separate legal entities under that constitution. So in terms of any future restorations or other aspects of that would be obviously for those who are party to the Belfast Good Friday Agreement and those who are elected to make those level of decisions.
Do you think, though, that measures could be adopted to ensure closer cooperation between the Northern Ireland Civil Service and the Home Civil Service in Great Britain?
We've talked earlier, regarding the level of interaction that I have, which is very positive within within my colleagues in the DAs and at the Whitehall level. I attend Wednesday morning colleagues alongside Simon, so I'm party to those discussions. We've talked further about representation from Northern Ireland Civil Service taking up permanent positions in the Northern Ireland office. JP has been the appointing panel for some of my perm secs in the office, and indeed I've been in the appointing panel within Whitehall and within Scotland. So those positions and relationships are strong. There are areas in terms of how evolved capability where we always don't do that and get that awareness. But the constitutional arrangements are the constitutional arrangements, and I, as an official, I'm not the person to be providing any direction in terms of how those may or should indeed evolve. My role is to give effect to those constitutional arrangements as a civil servant.
Is that cooperation that you've just spoken about reflected all the way down the Northern Ireland Civil Service, from you down to more junior officials?
Yes, of course. As part of the structures that are in place, the intergovernmental relations and structures that are now in place, the British Irish Council, there are subgroups that are established as part of that, and those strands that are now delivered, and we have frameworks within each department to deliver on those aspects. We have now the East-West Council, obviously established as part of the command paper for the restoration of the executive, and those will form new structures and new working groups. We have the outworkings of some of those areas. We talked about the framework for secondments, potentially between the parties within the British Irish Council. And then we have the operational aspects, of course. In some aspects, there needs to be very close cooperation to deliver the policy intent and our service delivery, and we talked about DEFRA in those areas. Again, indeed, the Home Office and the work in terms of our asylum seekers and those areas. In DBT and in innovation, I guess I look towards where Northern Ireland needs to go in the next 25 years. It's to focus on innovation and closing the gap in terms of our productivity levels. And many of those aspects are non-devolved funding aspects into innovation and to research. And I think those are areas where we can establish a better position of Northern Ireland in the context of what it offers, an overall UK proposition, so we can leverage the opportunity for growing all economies, as well as providing a pathway to sustainability for Northern Ireland.
Thank you. Damien Moore.
Thank you, Chairman. Just on the subject of interaction, how would you assess the progress made on increasing the number of secondments and interchanges between the UK government and devolved administrations? And also, do you think there should be priorities? Should junior civil servants or senior civil servants be prioritised? Could I ask that to Dr. Goodall first, please?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, really important to be maintaining these contacts, the contacts amongst our respective administrations. I think there are some limits on that. So some of the budgetary constraints that we've all been dealing from UK civil service perspective and through our own structures will potentially have impacted on some of this. But yeah, we currently support colleagues who have come into Welsh Government. There's about 52 UK Government colleagues working for us on our areas of policy and having that experience. We have 8 out from Welsh Government at the moment. Those numbers can go up and go down depending on the opportunities that arise at this stage. So I think we need to just maintain a healthy set of exchanges. But to your question about where it's required to be, I think it needs to be a cut through the structures. I think there's something about that more senior representation, and I've already talked about some of the experiences I have around my own Director General table, but to some extent making sure that we're able to secure the succession planning arrangements for civil servants who come through the structures with insight and experience of that is really important. And I've been really pleased to do a couple of things. Firstly, whenever we have development sessions, when civil service events are on, the ability to talk to all of our staff with all of their different backgrounds has been really important. Even to have some smaller conversations with colleagues about aspirations. But I know both myself and other colleagues have sponsored, where it's been Welsh Government leads, various development programmes, and I've been really keen as part of those to make sure that if there is a way of bringing people in to experience our assessment of devolution from a Welsh Government perspective, that we've been part of that. So very shortly I'll be joining one of those programmes when they're down for a day in Wales. I joined one last year when I sponsored one of the development programmes myself for UK Civil Service. I was really pleased to welcome all of those colleagues in from all of their different backgrounds into Welsh Government as well. So I just think we need to continue to build up the jigsaw of experience and hopefully keep offering that through our own experience as well as others across the UK too.
Thank you. Mr. Marks, please.
So I think this is a strength to build on. I alluded to some of the numbers earlier. We have good representation on the fast stream here, which is good to see.
Sorry to interrupt you, Mr. Marks. I'm really sorry to interrupt you, but you're breaking up quite badly here. So I don't know whether it's your end or ours.
It's probably me. I'll just try and lean towards the microphone a bit better.
If you could lean away a bit, it might be better. I think that. Could you try again?
Okay. Yes. Is that
that's
any good
better.
now?
That's a bit better.
Sorry about that. So look, I think it's a strength that we should continue to build on in terms of interchange. We've got good representation on the fast stream, talents, secondments.
Mr. Marks, I'm really sorry to interrupt you, but it's almost inaudible here.
Okay.
Can we switch to Jayne Brady, and then but perhaps one of your technical people could help you your end while we do that. If you've got any technical people, of course.
Thank you. Hopefully JP will get his technology addressed. So again, to echo the comments I made earlier, that we are very supportive of Office-of-Commons interchanges because of the issues that don't rehearse aren't possible within Northern Services in the UK, but we recognise the value and indeed the importance of Office-of-Commons. We did have an embargo because of resourcing up until July 2022, which has been lifted. If we look, I guess, towards the scale of that, I think there's an opportunity to broaden, particularly in terms of expertise, and that's very much welcome, the engagement that we've had as part of the British Irish Council to provide some level of framework, both to signpost inward and outward levels of Office-of-Commons. At different and varied levels, we have seconded people to the Northern Ireland office as part of the recent engagement with DEFRA. We have an outward secondment of 45 staff, and those have been predominantly at the EO2 levels and up to probably at a grade 5 level in terms of seniority. Previously, to secondments from UKG and into Northern Ireland, Sue Gray came on a secondment as part of to lead the Department of Finance as their permanent secretary. I think there had been perhaps a reluctance for staff to uproot, and I think the options regarding virtual working has changed that concept, and we should very much lean into that overall in terms of the concept of Office-of-Commons. And keen also to look towards how that can be done across all our regions. The nature of this comment is that has to be done on a grade transfer, so there is not an opportunity to apply into a promotion, and some of those areas have caused some areas of friction in terms of facilitating that's a comment. But again, we haven't had the scale that Scotland or Wales have in terms of the development of that because of the lack of an interchange programme.
Mr. Marks, I see some reinforcements appear to have arrived. Do you want to have another go?
Well, I don't know if it's working.
That's perfect. Perfect.
Is it? Well, okay, let's try. We might come in with a new laptop, but basically, I do think it's an opportunity and a strength to build on. There's a lot of interchange that goes on. A lot of colleagues on talent programs like the Fast Stream and other development programs. And I talked about the churn that's going on. The final point was simply the UK government's Places for Growth programme. I think, that increasingly provides more confidence to colleagues, whether it's in Wales, in Darlington, in Glasgow, in Edinburgh, that if you are moving from a Whitehall department to a devolved government, you can continue your civil service career, given the representation, increasing representation of the civil service outside of London. And we've seen significant movement in that regard over the recent years, and that enables that interchange and face-to-face collaboration much more. Thanks.
Thank you. I mean, it's been suggested in the past by your predecessors that house prices, geographical background, or where you draw your civil servants from, and the general disruption to people's lives are all obstacles and to these interactions. So in terms of how we can overcome them, how do you think we can overcome those obstacles? Is it all about technology, or are there other things that we could do? Dr. Goodall again, please.
Well, I think technology is definitely part of it. We are a hybrid organisation, so we are, with the support of ministers and the First Minister, ensuring that we are able to use that to our advantage, and that will affect some of the recruitment and give some of the flexibility. We have international offices who engage with us. We were all gathered yesterday hearing from the new First Minister of Wales, with all of our staff able to experience that, 250 in the room and everybody else joining it from remotely. So I do think technology and flexibility is part of that offer, definitely. But I think we do need to think about some of the practicalities and how society in general is changing. People are making different judgments. And also, I do think we need to think of younger colleagues coming into the civil service for the first time, who perhaps have some different expectations for the way in which they're going to work in that environment as well. So inevitably, financial remuneration award may be one of those areas, but to some extent, what is the offer of flexibility for progression and development as well? So, personally, I'd like to make sure we have a really positive offer from Welsh Government, but the more we can offer short-term opportunities where people can dip their toes in the water, have some experiences, and hopefully motivate people to want to come back to Welsh Government and to other devolved administrations, I think that would be a good outcome.
Thank you. Miss Brady, please.
I think probably that the pandemic has put the comfort to that actually I would espouse that Northern Ireland is a really fantastic place to bring up your children and to live in terms of that environment. I think there's a broader kind of concept as well. Technology also has aided in that in terms of that level of flexibility. But I think there's also a broader position that I would like to position Northern Ireland and the job in the civil service as, is that it doesn't have to be a job for life. That is for many individuals, but actually it is an area where you can helpfully and usefully get very significant learning. And I think Northern Ireland has really great opportunities because so much of the aspects of government are within the actual Northern Ireland Civil Service. They're running off our water and our trains and our buses, as well as all the policy divisions. And of course, as we look towards a new demographic who very much want to make that impact into life, there could be no better place to work than in the Northern Ireland Civil Service. So differentiate what that product proposition offering is to encourage others into it. Maybe that can be via secondment or via different routes. It also can be, and that can be from our private sector, or indeed our ALBs, or academic institutes, or other institutions, or administrations, but also that it doesn't have to necessarily be that commitment for life, that we can actually provide a valuable asset from that. And maybe instructing what our value proposition is to civil servants and employees coming into us, that it's a broader proposition and not just about time served, but actually what we will actually live and pay, but also what we will learn. And I think the opportunity for secondment ties into a very tangible aspect of that, what you'll be able to bring back from your own learning as well as delivering within those services.
Thank you very much.
Before you move on, Ronnie Cowan.
Thanks, Chair. Just very briefly, Mr. Marks, to drag you back to something you said earlier. You mentioned the jobs leaving London for jobs to the civil service out of the kingdom. I heard you say Darlington and Glasgow, but you didn't mention Aberdeen. And that was one of the promises as well. There were going to be 200 energy-related jobs in Aberdeen, and the latest figure I've heard is 35 by the end of 2027. Is that because the jobs aren't required, or is there some issue in getting people to relocate to Aberdeen?
Hopefully the sound's okay. I would have to get my colleagues to respond to you directly on that. I don't think there is a labour supply problem in terms of your point. As you say, there's deep capability in Aberdeen around energy, oil and gas, just transition and green technology. And so it is a huge opportunity for the UK civil service with regards to energy transformation. One of the reasons we have our green freeport in Cromarty Firth, and why the northeast of Scotland is so pivotal to Scotland. And I think, more broadly for Scotland, this is, again, as Jayne was saying, part of our pitch. We have 5 of the top universities out of the top 15 in the UK and Scotland now. Great capability and talent. And we're increasingly able to say, whether it's with the Scottish Government or other government departments located here, a career in the civil service is something that you can have across different departments with confidence, and move between central government, devolved government and local government for that matter, and build that capability. So no, I hope we'll see more places for growth in Aberdeen, as we have Darlington, Glasgow and others, and hopefully places for growth is here to stay. Thanks.
Well, perhaps when you've checked that point about Aberdeen, you could write to us, please, Mr. Marks. Damien Moore.
Thank you, Chairman. Written evidence we've received from the Department for Education said they had no centralised approach for secondments and interchanges with the devolved administrations. How far does this practice differ between government departments? We'll take naming and shaming if you would like as well. Dr. Goodall, if you would like to start.
It's difficult to comment on it, really. So I don't come here with any notes that say that I don't think exchanges happen at all, or secondments with the Department of Education. We've got a variety in a number of different departments, from MOD through to DLUC, and I found it worked very well. So I don't really have a league table of areas. When there's a need or a specification to have somebody involved, we seem to be able to have the pretty open conversation and make it happen. As I said, subject earlier, that I think that some of the budgetary constraints over recent years maybe have acted as a bit of a limitation. But I could go away and look for you, but I've not had anyone tell me it's a problem. Thank you.
Thank you. Miss Brady, please.
As I've referenced before, we don't have interchange agreements in place with UKG. Our arrangements are via secondments, so all of the posts that I would advertise generally are open to secondment as well as substantive positions. And I guess that reflects the different constitutional and the different legal instantiation with that. So our vehicle for looking at increasing engagement would be potentially through the framework that I discussed earlier, the British Irish Council are bringing together with our administrations to look towards a framework for signposting and delivering those principles. All our principles, we have a separate Northern Ireland Civil Service Commissioners, and our appointments are based on the merit principle, so that they're open and advertised in terms of the merit. Secondment would be in the context of that merit principle, and of course we have done those previously as well. So the level of interchange doesn't rely, and that is probably reflected in some of the figures in terms of the comment that we have in place, because those require certain structures to be in place and commissioners to be invoked.
Thank you. Mr. Marks, please.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not surprised by the DFE evidence, because almost by its nature, education is totally devolved in that regard. So we don't have a presence for DFE in Scotland in the same way that we do for DWP, HMRC, FCDO, DFID in the past, and others. And therefore, the opportunity of movement in between those departments in Scotland has been much more significant than it has for DFEs. There is an intergovernmental placements working group that colleagues have been working on. I know DLUC are looking at a pilot around interchange as well, and I can see my Transport Scotland teams looking at shadowing opportunities with the Department for Transport. So I think there are bilateral arrangements going on, and there's opportunities to improve this in the future too. Thanks.
Thank you. And then just moving on, both the Dunlop Review and Philip Rycroft, when giving oral evidence to us, said that entry to the senior civil servant should require 2 to 3 years experience in or with the devolved policy area. Would such an approach be beneficial to ministers working with those civil servants? Dr. Goodall.
Yes, there's a benefit of it. Whether that is a requirement for absolutely everybody going into the senior civil service, I'm not so sure. There are a range of departments where maybe that isn't the most significant issue. I mean, I welcome the sentiments of it, of course, in terms of how that would definitely bring some different experiences. I do feel we have something to offer. We also take the opportunity, though, of bringing people in with skills from Whitehall ourselves, and also with experiences from our other public services across Wales. So happy to go away and reflect on that more significantly. But again, I'd rather target some of the wider departmental capability and understanding, as I've highlighted in my evidence already over the last couple of hours or so, that maybe require that as an individual specification, because I can see that there would be some exceptions maybe.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Brady, please.
Thank you. I would say, in terms of, to Andrew's point, the requirements for the roles, so obviously within a DLUC capacity, the individuals in the senior civil service, it is very, it's a great asset to have had that experience of working with DAs, perhaps not so much in maybe other permanent sec roles within the offices. I would say overall, kind of my view is that there is a value in having some specialist capability at the perm sec level overall. Within that domain, our posts are generalist in nature within the civil service, but I do see the value in bringing in external expertise, of which we've seen previously people with economy background, and I know the senior civil service has done that as well with Sarah Mumby's appointment into the service. So I guess getting that diversity of viewpoints around that senior table is very important to cover all those aspects, but whether every individual needs to have that representation and experience of that, the DA's aspect. Some will be required more than others, and indeed I would imagine if they've travelled the journey within the civil service, there are a few departments which won't have had engagement with offices in other administrations.
Thank you. And Mr. Marks, please.
Yeah, just totally agree with that. I think it's something that should be encouraged and welcomed. I think it's positive, but to make it a requirement for all SCS roles across the UK civil service, I fear would not be practical, given the volume of SCS roles across the UK civil service and the number that we can offer in devolved governments at any one time, given our size. So, but nonetheless, as Jayne said, with the spirit and the intent of that, to deepen real understanding of devolution at all levels is to everyone's benefit, including ministers. But I'm not sure it is practical that we could do it for all SCS. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. And you'll be glad to hear we're coming to the last questions. And they're from Lloyd Russell Moyle.
Thank you very much, Chair. Do you think that the UK government civil service are getting sufficient and effective training for devolution? I mean, the people attending training has increased exponentially in the last 5 years. John Paul.
Yeah, so it sounds like you've got some data in front of you which shows that that is improving, which is encouraging.
Have you noticed the outcome of that in training?
Yeah, so I think, as I've alluded to, there is deep capability in understanding devolution in particularly those bespoke teams who focus on it, but also in those departments where there's that integration. Is there opportunities to go further and do more? I'm sure there are. I don't immediately have an area where I'm concerned, but I suppose one of the opportunities of the regular engagement with DLUC on their capability program, Devolution Learning Week, Civil Service Live, and other areas is as and when things pop up where there is that risk, we're able to openly explain we thought there was a bit of a knowledge gap here. And encourage colleagues to take the training up that's available. Thanks.
Fantastic. I mean, Devolution Week doubled the number of attendants last year. So, I mean, the figures are looking good. Jayne, same question. I mean, and I guess additionally, how do you make sure it's not just those that are really keen on devolution that attend things like Devolution Week and the devolution training, and the people who are the naysayers stay in the corner of their office and never actually engage with the issue?
Yeah, thank you. And of course, having the separate civil service creates further complications. So I have actively ensured that I've been involved in Devolution Week, even though I'm a different civil service, to show that representation, and along with panels with JP and with Andrew, but also providing that learning and engagement in terms of what the Belfast Good Friday Agreement is and the constitutional arrangements for that is really important. And I think you're right, the people who turn up and lean into that are the ones who perhaps have, or at least in need of it. I'm not aware actually of what training that the civil service provides in terms of devolution, and particularly in Northern Ireland. Notwithstanding the positive engagement we have, I am sometimes quite struck by the lack of knowledge of our fundamentally different constitutional arrangements in Northern Ireland, that there isn't a central, quite obviously that there isn't cabinet responsibility, that those structures which are necessary for the establishment and for the running of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement are not the same as it is in Whitehall. So even though those are perhaps intellectually known, but actually, that I cannot speak towards a different department's view or lines, such as finance or health, if it isn't an executive position in my role as. So I think it's in not just in the knowledge of the structures, but actually the implementation and the outworking of those can sometimes be more challenging as well. So I think, and that's with those officials to engage with us on the day-to-day that you don't just necessarily get in the training course.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much. Andrew?
Yeah, I think we need to keep building on the contacts. I said earlier in my evidence that I was a little worried that if devolution's the moment when we have the week of events, and then that's the last everybody thinks about it. I don't think we've quite mainstreamed it in the way that we intend it. But I've been really pleased to be alongside JP and Jayne at those events ourselves, where I hope we've demonstrated, our own willingness to help people to understand those areas and to support colleagues alongside. But I can really emphasise how the broader development programmes for the civil service, for me, have a different feel around devolution now. If I reverse to when I first joined the civil service in 2014, I'm on the steering board for our civil service live events, which happen across the whole of the UK, and there is a really important conversation to make sure that devolution is appearing in the front of the stage in the plenary, right through to the individual breakout groups. And what I've really liked about those approaches is the opportunity to just not try and describe this in a technical way, but actually to bring home the impact of what some of that means. So I think there should be a curiosity to understand the policy innovation that is happening across our respective administrations, because civil servants are doing different things to different effect. I remember when we had our first lawmaking powers in Welsh Government, I was supporting the then health minister in my NHS role to bring forward the organ donation laws in Wales. And when you look at the impact of those, learning from international evidence, they have now been implemented across all of the administrations because of the sort of the learning and the innovation and the best practice that we've done. And we have regular policy events where we are allowing us to describe the devolved administration experiences alongside UK government colleagues to hopefully be better in policy in overall terms. So I think it's really good to see the numbers going up. We could technically tick the box, but I just think that allowing ourselves to understand the outcomes that are being achieved as a result of these different approaches is also important as well.
No, I quite agree. Thank you very much. I mean, the Cabinet Manual has not been updated on devolution since 2017, and most of it is based from 2011, so completely ignores post-Brexit, completely ignores the kind of changing relationships that have been forged from them, and of course the Windsor Agreement, etc. So the last question that I've got is, what is your assessment of the current information about devolution in the Cabinet Manual and the slightly more updated, but not that much more updated, devolution guidance notes? And should there be a whole-scale update of the devolution guidance notes and then a reflection in the Cabinet Manual to make these updates? Or are we just happy bubbling along as we are? Andrew, should we go with you and do it the other way around this time?
Yes, I touched on a couple of examples earlier. So the devolution guidance has been lightly updated, sort of still really generally the same content from 2019, but was looked at again in 2023. But I agree with your sentiments that I don't think that is really conveying or setting a framework for the significance of the experiences that we've gone through. From EU exit, of course, which has had a big effect on the way in which we interact with each other, but actually even from some of the pandemic experiences that we've worked through. So I would argue for that to be upgraded. I think some translation into the Cabinet Manual absolutely would make sense for us to go down that route. But I still maintain, as I said earlier, that I do think some of the practical guidance that is around and available for civil servants who have a contact, who have an interest, I do think that the actual policy guidance that's there is a really good practical checklist with contact points and the way in which people can understand where they just need to account for the devolved responsibilities as well. But obviously, the more up-to-date we can make it, then the more we can discharge that effectively and professionally across the civil service.
So the policy documents there actually might be updated and quite practical, but they haven't been reflected in the updates of the Cabinet Manual as they should have been, if that's my summary.
Not quite translated across to that aspect, but we've got elements which definitely I can see have changed as a result of some of the recent devolution experience.
Good. Jayne, what's your feelings on this?
Thank you. I mean, obviously the updating of manuals is a UKG kind of perspective, but I haven't seen impediments in terms of that. I think the MOU that we have between the UKG and the MOU, there is merit in looking at, and honestly, it hasn't been updated for a period of time. I think the implications for the Windsor framework and the different levels and aspects that has from a constitutional perspective, and obviously the requirements and engagement we have, particularly with some departments, there may be a value in reflecting that more broadly within that guidance as things have changed in that regard. Which probably isn't reflected in that. It's more on an operational level at the moment we have with therefore we have provided training to that perspective within a Northern Ireland context as well.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And John Paul, last but not least, of course.
Yeah, well, I mean, I just recognise your point. A lot has happened in the last few years, and Kieran Martin, Philip Rycroft, others have talked about how devolution is a journey and a process, and it's sort of constantly changing. And I've referenced some examples of that fiscal framework. You've spoken about the Dunlop review, the IGR mechanisms. Clearly, we have some elections ahead of us too. So, what the next chapter of devolution looks like will need careful leadership And ultimately, whether it's the Cabinet Manual, the guidance notes, or the capabilities of the civil service, we need to make sure they are up to date, modern, and in giving ministers the best possible advice to navigate the future. So I'm with you on the point that this is something that requires constant diligence and something we're all, the three of us, committed to leading as best we can. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. And you'll be delighted to hear, I'm sure, that that is the last question. It's been a very lengthy session. Can I thank you all for appearing here today and helping us with this inquiry? Mr. Marks, I think you're going to let us have a small note on the point raised by Mr. Cowan. And if there is any other aspect of the evidence you've given you'd like to augment, I mean, by all means, please do write to us. But thank you all once again. Order, order. Thank you.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.